The sound of a single gunshot echoed across the desolate prairie, startling Penelope Winters from her dreamless sleep. She bolted upright in the back of the wagon, her heart pounding against her ribs. The early morning light filtered through the canvas cover as she peered out, only to discover her worst fear had come true. The wagon train was gone, leaving nothing behind but wheel tracks stretching toward the western horizon. Penelope scrambled out of the wagon, her boots landing on the hard, packed dirt. The year was 1867, and the journey from Missouri to California had already claimed the lives of 12 people in their party, including her parents who succumbed to cholera just 2 weeks prior. At 22 years old, she was alone, stranded in the middle of nowhere with nothing but her family's wagon, a limping horse, and whatever supplies remained after the others had likely helped themselves before abandoning her. "Hello." She called, her voice small against the vastness of the Wyoming Territory. "Is anyone there?" No answer came except the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Penelope felt her knees weaken as the reality of her situation crashed down upon her. The wagon train leader, Mr. Blackwater, had made his opinion clear the night before they couldn't afford to keep waiting while her horse recovered from its injury. They needed to make it through the mountain pass before the first snow. "We leave at first light, Miss Winters," he had told her with cold finality. "With or without you." She had believed someone would wake her, that someone would show compassion. Instead, they had left her to die. A tear slid down her cheek, but Penelope quickly brushed it away. Crying wouldn't help her situation. She climbed back into the wagon to assess her supplies: a half-barrel of flour, some salted pork, beans, coffee, sugar, 2 gallons of water, her father's rifle with limited ammunition, and a few personal belongings. It wouldn't last long. As she counted her meager supplies, the sound of hoofbeats in the distance made her freeze. Grabbing her father's rifle, she positioned herself behind the wagon wheel, trying to steady her trembling hands. The rider approached from the east, the direction from which they had come, not from the wagon train ahead. The man who came into view rode a magnificent chestnut stallion. His wide-brimmed hat shaded his face, but as he drew closer, Penelope could make out a strong jaw darkened with stubble. He wore a dusty leather vest over a faded blue shirt with a pistol holstered at his hip. "Miss Winters," he called out, reining his horse to a stop about 20 feet from her wagon. "Miss Penelope Winters." Penelope kept the rifle aimed at him. "Who's asking?" The man removed his hat, revealing tousled brown hair and eyes the color of a summer sky. He couldn't have been more than 26 or 27 years old. "Name's Ethan Quincy. I was riding scout for your wagon train. Just caught up with them about 10 miles west, and they told me they'd left someone behind." His jaw tightened. "Wasn't right, so I rode back." "They told you they left me?" Penelope asked, suspicion lacing her voice even as hope fluttered in her chest. "Not exactly." Ethan's expression darkened. "I counted the wagons and noticed yours was missing. When I asked Blackwater, he just shrugged and said you'd chosen to stay behind. Didn't take much to figure out what really happened." Penelope lowered the rifle slightly. "Why would you come back for me? You don't know me." "Madam, where I come from, we don't leave people to die in the wilderness," Ethan said simply. "It ain't right, and it sure ain't how decent folk behave." Penelope studied him for a long moment. There was something in his direct gaze that spoke of honesty. Still, she'd been fooled before. "What's your plan then, Mr. Quincy?" "That depends on you, Miss Winters," he said, dismounting but keeping a respectful distance. "Your horse won't make it pulling that wagon through the mountains. We could try to catch up with the train, but frankly, I'm not eager to travel with people who'd leave a woman alone on the prairie." "What other choice do I have?" Penelope asked, finally lowering the rifle completely. Ethan gestured to the south. "There's a settlement about 4 days' ride from here, Fort Laramie. It's growing fast since the war ended. Good people there, you could winter over, maybe find work. Come spring, you could decide whether to continue west or—" He trailed off, leaving the possibilities unspoken. Penelope looked back at her wagon, the last physical reminder of her family and their dream of California. "I can't just abandon everything." "We bring what we can carry," Ethan said. I've got some canvas. We can make bundles for my horse. Your horse can carry you and some supplies." "And the rest?" Penelope asked, her voice catching. "We bury it or hide it well, mark the spot, maybe come back for it." They both knew that was unlikely, but it was a kindness that he offered the possibility. Penelope took a deep breath. "Why would you do this? Risk yourself for a stranger?" Ethan looked away for a moment, squinting at the horizon. "My sister died 2 years ago. Fever took her in the middle of nowhere because the people she was traveling with wouldn't stop long enough for a doctor to treat her." He looked back at Penelope, determination in his eyes. "I swore I'd never let that happen to anyone else if I could help it." Something in his story resonated with Penelope's own loss, and in that moment, she decided to trust him. "I accept your help, Mr. Quincy. Call me Ethan," he said with a slight smile. "Ethan," she repeated, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over her. "I'm Penelope." They spent the rest of the day sorting through her belongings, making difficult choices about what to keep and what to leave behind. Ethan dug a deep hole beneath a distinctive rock formation, and they buried her mother's china and her father's books, along with other treasured items too heavy to carry. Penelope wrapped her mother's wedding ring in a handkerchief and tucked it safely into her pocket. By nightfall, they had packed what they could onto their horses. Ethan built a small fire and prepared a simple meal of beans and coffee. As they ate under the vast canopy of stars, Penelope felt a curious mixture of grief and hope. "Tomorrow we head south," Ethan said, pouring her another cup of coffee. "The trail isn't as established, but it's safer than trying to catch up with the train." "Have you been to Fort Laramie before?" Penelope asked. "Several times. It's a proper settlement now." "Army post is still there, but there's a growing town around it. Good people." He hesitated. "You'll find your feet there, Miss Winters." "Penelope," she corrected him. "If we're to travel together, I think formalities are unnecessary." Ethan nodded, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "Penelope it is." He looked into the fire. "Get some rest. We have a long ride ahead of us." As Penelope settled into her bedroll near the fire, she watched Ethan check their perimeter one last time. Despite her situation, despite all she had lost, she felt an unexpected sense of security in this stranger's presence. She fell asleep to the soft sounds of the prairie night, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it not alone, but with a man who had ridden back for her when no one else would. The dawn arrived with a chill that penetrated Penelope's wool blanket, waking her with chattering teeth. She opened her eyes to find Ethan already awake, tending a small fire and brewing coffee. The smell of it made her stomach rumble, reminding her that despite her circumstances, life continued. "Morning," Ethan said, handing her a tin cup of the steaming liquid. "Storm brewing to the north." "We'd best get moving." Penelope accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around the warm metal. "Thank you." She glanced at the dark clouds gathering on the horizon. "Will we make it to shelter before it hits?" "There's an old trapper's cabin about half a day's ride from here," Ethan replied, pouring the remaining coffee into his own cup. "If we move quickly, we should reach it by midday." They packed up camp efficiently, Penelope following Ethan's lead. Her horse, a dappled gray mare named Daisy, seemed to have recovered somewhat from her lameness, but Ethan insisted that Penelope ride his stallion Thunder while he led both horses on foot. "I can walk," Penelope protested, "or we could take turns." "No offense, but you're not used to the pace we'll need to keep," Ethan said, adjusting Thunder's saddle. "Besides, I've spent most of my life on foot, helps me read the trail better." Reluctantly, Penelope mounted the powerful stallion, feeling somewhat out of place on the magnificent animal. As they set out, the vastness of the prairie stretched before them, making her feel insignificant against its endless expanse. "May I ask you something, Ethan?" Penelope said as they traveled south, the morning sun warming their backs. "Ask away," he replied, his eyes scanning the horizon continually. "How did you become a scout? You seem young for such responsibility." Ethan was quiet for a moment, as if weighing how much to share. "My pa was a trapper. Taught me to read the land, track game, find water where others saw only dust. When he died, I was 16. Worked cattle drives for a while, then the war came. He glanced back at her. Served in the Union cavalry, mostly as a scout. After the war, seemed natural to keep doing what I knew. I'm sorry about your father, Penelope said softly. Been a long time, Ethan replied, though his tone suggested the wound wasn't fully healed. What about your folks, if you don't mind my asking? Penelope swallowed hard. The grief was still raw, but talking about them felt like keeping their memory alive. My father was a schoolteacher in St. Louis. Mother came from a good family in Boston, but she gave it all up to marry him. They dreamed of starting a school in California. She paused, fighting back tears. Cholera took them both within days of each other, 2 weeks ago. Ethan stopped walking and looked up at her, genuine sympathy in his eyes. I'm truly sorry, Penelope. Losing both parents at once, that's a heavy burden. The worst part was how quickly everyone moved on, she admitted, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. They were buried in unmarked graves beside the trail, a few prayers said, and then it was as if they'd never existed. The wagon train couldn't afford to lose a day of travel. That's the cruelty of the trail west, Ethan said quietly. Death becomes commonplace. People harden themselves against it. Is that what happened to you? Penelope asked, immediately regretting the personal question. To her surprise, Ethan didn't take offense. Maybe. Though I like to think I still know the difference between necessary hardness and plain inhumanity. He gestured toward the horizon. Leaving you behind crossed that line. They continued in companionable silence for several hours. Around midday, as promised, a small cabin came into view nestled at the base of a rocky outcropping. It was crude but solid, with a stone chimney and a small corral for the horses. Not much to look at, Ethan said, but it'll keep us dry. As if on cue, the first fat raindrops began to fall. They hurried the last quarter-mile to the cabin, reaching it just as the sky opened up. Ethan quickly led the horses into the corral, where a lean-to offered some protection from the elements, while Penelope pushed open the cabin door. The interior was dusty but surprisingly intact. A small table with 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, and a narrow bed frame with ropes instead of a mattress. Penelope set about clearing away cobwebs while Ethan brought in their supplies and started a fire. Whose cabin is this? She asked as they settled in, the rain drumming steadily on the roof. Belonged to an old mountain man named Pierre, Ethan explained, hanging his wet coat near the fire. Died a few years back. Now it serves as shelter for travelers. Unspoken rule is you leave it better than you found it, and replace any supplies you use if you can. The fire grew stronger, warming the small space and casting flickering shadows on the walls. Ethan prepared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack softened in coffee. They ate in silence, the storm outside intensifying with occasional cracks of thunder that made Penelope jump. Storms set in for the night, Ethan observed, peering through the cabin's single window. Good thing we found shelter. Yes, Penelope agreed, suddenly aware of their isolation and proximity. She was alone in a cabin with a man she'd met only yesterday. In Boston, such a situation would have been scandalous. Here in the wilderness, it was simply survival. Ethan seemed to read her thoughts. You take the bed, he said, unrolling his bedroll near the door. I'll sleep here. Thank you, Penelope said, grateful for his consideration. She hesitated, then added, I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come back for me. Ethan's eyes met hers across the fire. Let's be glad we don't have to find out. Later, as she lay on the rope bed with her blanket pulled tight around her, listening to the rain and Ethan's steady breathing from across the room, Penelope realized she felt safer than she had since her parents died. It was a strange feeling to find security with a stranger, but there was something about Ethan Quincy that inspired trust. Tomorrow, they would continue their journey to Fort Laramie, and Penelope found herself wondering what would happen when they reached civilization. Would Ethan simply see her safely delivered and then ride away, his good deed done? The thought created an unexpected hollow feeling in her chest. Sleep eventually claimed her, her dreams filled with endless prairies and a lone rider coming back for her through the mist. The storm continued through the night and into the morning, keeping them confined to the cabin. Ethan spent the time repairing Penelope's worn boots with supplies from his pack, while she mended a tear in his shirt. The domesticity of the scene struck Penelope as both strange and comforting. "You're good with a needle," Ethan commented as she handed him the repaired shirt, the stitches nearly invisible. "My mother insisted I learn all the domestic arts," Penelope explained. Though she also made sure I could read Latin and calculate sums faster than most men, Ethan raised an eyebrow. "An educated woman, that'll serve you well in Fort Laramie." "Will it?" Penelope asked, genuine concern in her voice. "I've heard the frontier has little use for book learning." "Maybe once," Ethan acknowledged, "but things are changing, towns are growing, families want their children educated." He gave her a considering look. "You said your parents wanted to start a school in California. Maybe you could do the same in Wyoming." The idea took root in Penelope's mind. "I hadn't thought of that." By midday, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, and they decided to continue their journey. The trail was muddy and slick, forcing them to travel slowly. Ethan no longer needed to walk. Daisy's leg had improved enough to bear Penelope's weight, allowing each of them to ride. They made camp that evening in a small grove of cottonwood trees. As they sat by the fire, Ethan taught Penelope how to clean and load her father's rifle properly. "A woman alone needs to know how to defend herself," he explained, watching her practice the movements. "I'm not alone now," Penelope said without thinking, then blushed at the implication of her words. Ethan's expression softened momentarily before he looked away. "True enough, but I won't always be around." The statement hung between them, a reminder of the temporary nature of their arrangement. The next day dawned clear and bright. They made good progress, and by late afternoon, Ethan pointed to a distant smudge on the horizon. "See that? Smoke from Fort Laramie. We'll reach it by tomorrow afternoon." Penelope felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Civilization meant safety, but it also meant the end of their journey together. That night, as they made camp by a small creek, Penelope finally asked the question that had been on her mind. "What will you do after we reach Fort Laramie?" Ethan poked at the fire with a stick, considering his answer. "Not sure, winter's coming, might be best to stay put till spring." "As a scout, you must have many opportunities," Penelope ventured. "Some," he agreed. "Army's always looking for men who know the territory." "Or I could try my hand at trapping, like my pa." He glanced at her. "What about you? Any plans beyond reaching the fort?" Penelope twisted a strand of her dark hair around her finger, a habit from childhood. "I've been thinking about what you said about teaching. If there are families there, perhaps they'd welcome a school." "I reckon they would," Ethan said with a smile that transformed his usually serious face. "The settlement's growing fast, lots of children running wild." They fell silent, the only sounds the crackling fire and the gentle murmur of the creek. Then Ethan cleared his throat. "Penelope, He began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. "I want you to know that when we reach Fort Laramie, I'll make sure you're settled properly before I go anywhere. I won't just drop you there and ride off." "I appreciate that," Penelope said, touched by his concern, "though I don't want to be a burden on your time." "You're not a burden," Ethan said firmly. "Never think that." Their eyes met across the fire, and something passed between them, an unspoken connection that neither was ready to acknowledge. Penelope was the first to look away, suddenly aware of her racing heart. The next morning, they broke camp early, both eager to reach their destination. The terrain gradually changed from open prairie to rolling hills dotted with pine trees. By noon, they could clearly see the walls of the fort in the distance and the cluster of buildings that made up the growing settlement surrounding it. "There it is," Ethan said, "Fort Laramie." As they approached, Penelope could see people moving about, soldiers in uniform, women hanging laundry, children playing. The sight of civilization after days in the wilderness brought tears to her eyes. At the edge of town, they paused. Penelope suddenly felt self-conscious about her appearance. Her dress was travel-stained, her hair unkempt despite her best efforts to remain presentable. "Don't worry," Ethan said, seeming to read her thoughts again. "You look fine. Besides, folks here understand the realities of travel." They rode into town, drawing curious glances from passers-by. Ethan led them to a modest boarding house with a sign declaring clean rooms, reasonable rates. "Mrs. Patterson runs this place," Ethan explained as they dismounted. "She's fair and decent. A widow who came west with her husband during the gold rush." A plump, gray-haired woman emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face lit up when she saw Ethan. "Ethan Quincy, haven't seen you in months. What brings you to our little corner of civilization?" "Hello, Mrs. Patterson," Ethan greeted her with genuine warmth. "I've brought someone who needs a place to stay." He turned to Penelope. "This is Miss Penelope Winters. Her wagon train left her behind when her horse went lame. She's looking to settle here for a while." Mrs. Patterson's expression changed to one of outrage. "Left you behind? What kind of monsters were you traveling with?" Without waiting for an answer, she bustled forward and took Penelope's hand. "You poor dear, you come right in. I've got a nice room upstairs with a real feather bed. You look like you could use a hot bath and a decent meal." Penelope glanced at Ethan, who nodded encouragingly. "Go on, get settled. I'll see to the horses and bring your things." Allowing herself to be led inside, Penelope felt a wave of exhaustion hit her. The strain of the past days, of the past weeks, suddenly caught up with her and she stumbled slightly. "Steady now," Mrs. Patterson said kindly, supporting her arm. "You're safe here." An hour later, freshly bathed and dressed in the cleanest of her traveling clothes, Penelope sat at Mrs. Patterson's kitchen table, a bowl of hearty stew before her. Ethan joined them, also cleaned up, his hair still damp from his own wash. "I've been telling Miss Winters about your boarding house," Ethan said to Mrs. Patterson, "and that she might find work here as a teacher." "A teacher?" Mrs. Patterson exclaimed. "Why, that's exactly what we need. The children here get precious little education. Some of the mothers try to teach reading and figures, but there's no proper school." "I was trained by my father, who was a school teacher," Penelope explained, hope blossoming in her chest. "I had intended to help my parents establish a school in California." "Well, their loss is our gain," Mrs. Patterson declared. "I'll introduce you to Reverend Clark. He's been trying to organize something for the children." As they ate, Mrs. Patterson filled them in on the news of the settlement, who had arrived, who had left, what buildings were going up. Fort Laramie was growing rapidly, with new families arriving weekly, drawn by the promise of free land under the Homestead Act. "And what about you, Ethan?" Mrs. Patterson asked finally. "Just passing through as usual." Ethan hesitated, his eyes flickering to Penelope. "Not sure yet, might winter here." Mrs. Patterson looked between them, a knowing smile playing at her lips. "Well, I've got rooms enough for both of you." "Separate ones, of course," she added with a wink that made Penelope blush. Later, as Penelope prepared to retire to her room, the first real bed she would sleep in since leaving St. Louis, Ethan caught her at the foot of the stairs. "I'll come by tomorrow," he said, his hat in his hands. "Help you get oriented to the town." "I would like that," Penelope replied, suddenly shy. "Thank you, Ethan, for everything." "No need for thanks," he said gruffly. "Just glad you're safe." As Penelope climbed the stairs to her room, she felt Ethan's eyes following her. For the first time since her parents' death, she felt a flicker of something like hope for the future. Fort Laramie might not have been her intended destination, but perhaps it was where she was meant to be all along. The following morning, Penelope woke to the unfamiliar sounds of civilization, voices calling, horses neighing, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer. For a moment she was disoriented, then remembered where she was. The events of the past few days seemed almost dreamlike in the morning light filtering through her window. A soft knock at her door roused her fully. "Miss Winters," Mrs. Patterson's voice called. "Breakfast is ready when you are." Penelope dressed quickly in her second-best dress, which Mrs. Patterson had kindly pressed for her. Downstairs, she found not only her hostess but also Ethan, looking more rested than she had yet seen him. He stood when she entered the dining room, a gesture that reminded her of civilization's niceties. "Good morning," he greeted her. "Sleep well." "Better than I have in months," Penelope admitted, taking a seat at the table where plates of eggs, bacon, and biscuits awaited them. "I've arranged for you to meet Reverend Clark this afternoon," Mrs. Patterson said, pouring coffee. "And in the meantime," Ethan has offered to show you around our little community." Breakfast was a pleasant affair, with Mrs. Patterson regaling them with stories of the settlement's early days. By the time they finished eating, Penelope was eager to explore her new home. Fort Laramie had grown considerably since its days as a fur trading post. The military fort itself was still active, with soldiers in blue uniforms visible on its walls, but the real growth was in the civilian settlement that had sprung up around it. A main street boasted a general store, a bank, a hotel, 2 saloons, a barber shop, and various other businesses. Side streets held modest homes and workshops. It was a far cry from St. Louis or Boston, but it had the energy of place on the rise. "What do you think?" Ethan asked as they walked, nodding to people he knew. "It's more established than I expected," Penelope admitted. "I thought we'd find a collection of tents and crude cabins." "That was Fort Laramie 5 years ago," Ethan explained. "The end of the war brought a flood of people west. Governments encouraging settlement to secure the territories." At the general store, the proprietor, Mr. Jenkins, greeted Ethan warmly before turning curious eyes on Penelope. Ethan introduced her as Miss Winters, a schoolteacher looking to settle here. A schoolteacher. "That's exactly what we need," Mr. Jenkins exclaimed, echoing Mrs. Patterson's sentiment. "My boys can barely write their names, and my wife hasn't the time to teach them properly with the new baby." This scene repeated itself throughout their tour of the town. Everywhere they went, Penelope was greeted with enthusiasm once her profession was mentioned. By the time they reached the small church where they were to meet Reverend Clark, she was feeling overwhelmed by the warm reception. "I had no idea there would be such demand for a teacher," she murmured to Ethan. "Folks out here value education," he replied. "They know it's the key to a better future for their children." Reverend Clark, a thin man with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair, practically fell to his knees in gratitude when Ethan introduced Penelope. "Miss Winters, you are an answer to prayer," he declared. "I've been writing to missionary societies back east for months, begging them to send us a qualified teacher." The church had a small back room that could serve as a schoolhouse, he explained, showing them the space. It was plain but clean, with enough room for perhaps 20 students. "We can build proper benches," the Reverend continued enthusiastically. "And I have some books, not many, I'm afraid, but enough to start. When could you begin?" Penelope, caught off guard by his eagerness, glanced at Ethan. "Perhaps Miss Winters could use a few days to settle in," Ethan suggested diplomatically. "She's had a difficult journey." Of course, Reverend Clark agreed immediately. "Forgive my enthusiasm. Would next Monday suit? That gives you 4 days to prepare." "Monday would be fine," Penelope agreed, her mind already cataloging what she would need. They left the church with Penelope officially employed as Fort Laramie's first schoolteacher, with a modest salary to be collected from the parents whose children would attend. "That solves the question of your livelihood," Ethan said as they walked back toward the boarding house. "Mrs. Patterson charges fair rates for room and board. You should manage comfortably." "It all seems to be falling into place," Penelope marveled, still somewhat stunned by how quickly events were moving. "Almost as if..." "As if what?" Ethan prompted when she trailed off. "As if I was meant to be left behind," Penelope finished softly. "As if this was where I was supposed to end up all along." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Maybe so," he finally said, "though I still think Blackwater was a heartless bastard for leaving you." His protective anger on her behalf warmed Penelope. "I'm beginning to think it was a blessing in disguise." They had reached the boarding house. On the porch, Ethan hesitated. "I've got some business at the fort this afternoon. Army quartermaster wants to talk about scout work." "Oh," Penelope said, trying to hide her disappointment. "Of course, you have your own affairs to attend to." "I'll be back for supper," Ethan assured her. "If that's all right." "I'd like that," Penelope replied, unable to keep the smile from her face. As she watched him walk away, Penelope realized with a start that in just a few days, this man had become important to her in a way she hadn't anticipated. The thought both thrilled and frightened her. Back inside, Mrs. Patterson was waiting with a knowing look. "That Ethan Quincy is quite the man," she commented as she helped Penelope remove her shawl. Known him for years, and I've never seen him look at a woman the way he looks at you. Mrs. Patterson, Penelope exclaimed, blushing furiously. You misunderstand. He merely felt responsible for my safety after finding me abandoned. If you say so, dear, the older woman replied, patently unconvinced. Now let me show you where we keep the washing things. A lady needs to keep up appearances, especially with a handsome man coming to supper. Despite her embarrassment, Penelope couldn't help the flutter of anticipation in her stomach at the thought of seeing Ethan again that evening. True to his word, Ethan returned for supper, bringing with him news that the army had hired him for occasional scout work during the winter. Nothing too extensive, he explained as they ate. Just checking the nearby trails, guiding supply runs. It means I'll be based here until spring at least. The pleasure Penelope felt at this news was difficult to conceal. Over the next few days, they fell into a comfortable routine. Ethan would escort her around town in the mornings, introducing her to families with school-aged children. In the afternoons, he attended to his own business while Penelope prepared for her new role, cataloging available books and creating lesson plans. By Sunday evening, on the eve of her first day of school, 23 children were enrolled, far more than the small room could comfortably hold. We'll manage, Penelope assured Reverend Clark, who was fretting over the logistics. I'll divide them by age and ability. The older ones can help teach the younger. That night, too nervous to sleep, Penelope sat by her window, looking out at the stars. A soft knock at her door startled her. Penelope, Ethan's voice was low. Are you still awake? She opened the door to find him standing there, holding a small wooden box. I thought you might be nervous about tomorrow, he said. I wanted to give you this. Inside the box was a beautiful brass bell. For calling your students to order, Ethan explained. Ethan, it's perfect, Penelope breathed, deeply touched by his thoughtfulness. Thank you. You'll do fine tomorrow, he assured her, his eyes warm in the lamplight. Those kids are lucky to have you. Their gazes held for a long moment, and Penelope felt herself drawn toward him. For a breathless second, she thought he might kiss her. Instead, he stepped back, clearing his throat. I should let you rest, he said. Good night, Penelope. Good night, Ethan, she replied, clutching the bell to her chest as she watched him retreat down the hallway. Her first day of school was both chaotic and exhilarating. Children ranging from 5 to 16 filled the small room, some excited, some reluctant, all curious about their new teacher. Using the bell Ethan had given her, Penelope called them to order and began the process of assessing what they knew and what they needed to learn. By the end of the day, she was exhausted but fulfilled. Walking back to the boarding house, she found Ethan waiting for her on the porch, his expression eager. How did it go? He asked, rising to meet her. Wonderfully, Penelope replied with genuine enthusiasm. They're bright children eager to learn. Some of the older ones can already read quite well. I knew you'd be a natural, Ethan said, his pride in her evident. Over the next weeks, Penelope settled into her role as Fort Laramie's schoolteacher. The children made rapid progress under her guidance, and their parents expressed their gratitude in various ways: baskets of eggs, freshly baked bread, offers to help build additional benches for the growing school. Ethan, true to his word, remained in Fort Laramie, taking short scouting assignments but always returning within a few days. Each time he left, Penelope felt his absence keenly, and each return brought a joy she could no longer deny to herself. They spent their evenings together, often walking through town or sitting on the boarding house porch, talking about everything and nothing. Penelope shared stories of her childhood in St. Louis, of her parents' dreams for California. Ethan spoke of his years as a cavalry scout during the war, of the beauty and danger of the territories he'd traversed. As November turned to December, the first snows came, blanketing Fort Laramie in white. The temperature dropped, forcing people indoors. School continued, with children bundled in scarves and mittens, the small stove in the classroom working overtime to keep the space warm. One evening, as Penelope and Ethan sat by the fire in Mrs. Patterson's parlor, she finally asked the question that had been on her mind. What will happen in spring, Ethan? Will you leave Fort Laramie? He stared into the flames for a long moment before answering. I've been thinking about that. The Army's offered me a permanent position as a scout based here. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. But I've also been considering other options. Such as, Penelope prompted when he didn't continue. There's land available south of here, good water, decent soil, a man could build something there. His eyes held hers. A future, Penelope's heart quickened. Are you thinking of homesteading? Been thinking about a lot of things lately, Ethan admitted. Things I never considered before. He reached across the space between them and took her hand. Penelope, he was interrupted by the parlor door opening as Mrs. Patterson entered with a tray of tea. If she noticed their quickly separated hands or flushed faces, she gave no indication. Thought you might like something warm, she said, setting down the tray. It's bitter cold tonight. The moment was broken, but something had shifted between them. As they sipped their tea, Penelope caught Ethan watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Later, as she prepared for bed, Penelope replayed their conversation in her mind. Was Ethan suggesting what she thought he was? The possibility that he might be considering a future that included her filled her with a happiness she hadn't dared hope for. The next morning, Penelope woke to the sound of excited voices. Looking out her window, she saw a crowd gathering in the street. Dressing quickly, she went downstairs to find Mrs. Patterson already at the door. What's happening? Penelope asked. Wagon train just arrived, Mrs. Patterson explained. Late in the season, but they made it. Poor souls look half frozen. Curious, Penelope stepped onto the porch. Through the swirling snow, she could make out several wagons rolling slowly into town, their canvas covers laden with snow. People were emerging from buildings to greet the newcomers, offering assistance and shelter. Then she saw him. Augustus Blackwater, the wagon master who had left her behind, was directing the lead wagon toward the hotel. Penelope froze, a mixture of anger and fear washing over her. Penelope, Mrs. Patterson's concerned voice broke through her shock. You're white as a sheet. Do you know those people? Yes, Penelope whispered. That's my wagon train, the one that left me to die. Mrs. Patterson's expression hardened. Well, isn't that something? She patted Penelope's arm. Don't you worry, you're established here now, they can't hurt you. But Penelope wasn't convinced. What if Blackwater's version of events painted her as the one at fault? What if the people of Fort Laramie believed him over her? Her hard-won place in the community suddenly felt precarious. She retreated inside, her mind racing. Should she confront Blackwater, hide until the train moved on? She wasn't sure what to do. The decision was made for her when, an hour later, a knock came at the boarding house door. Mrs. Patterson answered it, then called for Penelope. Miss Winters, Blackwater said when she appeared, his tone falsely jovial. Glad to see you made it to civilization. When we had to leave you behind, we feared the worst. Did you? Penelope replied coldly, aware of Mrs. Patterson hovering protectively nearby. How concerning, since you made no effort to ensure my survival. Blackwater's smile faltered. Now, Miss Winters, you know we couldn't delay the entire train for one person. We left you with a wagon and supplies, more than most would have done. You left her to die, you mean, came Ethan's voice from behind Blackwater. He had approached silently, his expression thunderous. Alone on the prairie with a lame horse and winter coming on. Blackwater turned, sizing up Ethan with a wary eye. And who might you be? The man who went back for her when you wouldn't, Ethan replied, stepping up to stand beside Penelope. A crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the confrontation. Penelope could see faces she'd come to know, parents of her students, shopkeepers, the reverend, all watching with concern. Is this true, Blackwater? Demanded a man from the wagon train. You told us Miss Winters chose to stay behind. She had a choice, Blackwater blustered. Come with us on foot or stay with her wagon. Some choice, Mrs. Patterson scoffed loudly. Walk hundreds of miles or die alone. Murmurs of disapproval rippled through the crowd. Blackwater's face reddened. Now see here, he began, but Ethan cut him off. I think you'd best move on, Blackwater, he said quietly. You're not welcome here. You can't speak for this town, Blackwater retorted. No, but I can, said Reverend Clark, stepping forward. And I agree with Mr. Quincy. We don't welcome men who abandon women to the wilderness. Other voices joined in, supporting Penelope and condemning Blackwater's actions. The wagon master looked around, realizing he'd lost the crowd. Fine, he spat. We'll be moving on come morning. Those continuing to California can join us. The rest can stay in this God-forsaken outpost if they choose. He stormed off, leaving a buzz of conversation in his wake. Penelope felt Ethan's hand on her arm, steady and reassuring. You all right? He asked softly. Yes, she replied, surprised to find it was true. The fear she'd felt at seeing Blackwater had been replaced by a sense of vindication. Thank you for standing up for me. Always will, Ethan promised, his eyes holding hers. That evening, several families from the wagon train came to call on Penelope, apologizing for not preventing her abandonment and expressing their relief at finding her safe. Some were continuing west, but others, weary of travel and impressed by what they'd seen of Fort Laramie, were considering staying. We could use more good people here, Penelope told them, and your children would be welcome in my school. By morning, 5 families had decided to remain in Fort Laramie, a decision that infuriated Blackwater but delighted the townsfolk. The rest of the wagon train departed with the first light, continuing their journey west. Standing beside Ethan as they watched the wagons roll away, Penelope felt a strange sense of closure. The path that had once been hers was moving on without her, but she no longer regretted being left behind. Never thought I'd be grateful to Blackwater for anything, she mused, but if he hadn't left me, I wouldn't be here now. And where exactly is here? Ethan asked, his tone making the question more significant than the words themselves. Penelope looked up at him, understanding his meaning. Here is where I'm meant to be, she said softly. Where I want to be. Ethan's face broke into a rare, full smile. Good, he said simply. Because I was hoping you felt that way. As Christmas approached, Fort Laramie transformed. Despite the frontier setting, or perhaps because of it, the town embraced the holiday with enthusiasm. Evergreen boughs decorated doorways, candles glowed in windows, and plans for a community celebration at the church took shape. Penelope threw herself into preparations, organizing her students to perform Christmas recitations and carols. The excitement of the children was contagious, and even the most stoic of the townspeople found themselves caught up in the holiday spirit. Ethan had been away for several days on a scouting mission for the army, and Penelope found herself watching the trail from town anxiously, hoping for his return before Christmas Eve. When he finally rode in on the afternoon of December 23rd, she was teaching her last class before the holiday break. The children noticed her distraction when Ethan appeared at the schoolroom door, snow dusting his coat and hat. Class dismissed early, she announced, unable to keep the joy from her voice. Merry Christmas, children, they scattered with happy shouts, leaving Penelope alone with Ethan. He removed his hat, shaking off the snow. You're back, she said, stating the obvious in her relief. Promised I would be, he replied, moving toward her. Wouldn't miss Christmas. He looked tired but glad to see her. Without thinking, Penelope stepped forward and embraced him. For a moment he stiffened in surprise, then his arms came around her, holding her close. I missed you, she confessed into his shoulder. Missed you too, he murmured against her hair. More than I should admit. They pulled apart reluctantly, suddenly aware of the intimacy of the moment. Ethan cleared his throat. I brought you something, he said, reaching into his coat. For Christmas. The gift was small, wrapped in plain brown paper. Penelope opened it carefully to reveal a delicate silver locket. Ethan, she breathed, it's beautiful. Open it, he urged. Inside was a tiny, expertly cut silhouette, a perfect miniature portrait of Penelope in profile. How did you? There's a fellow in Cheyenne who does them, Ethan explained. I had him make it from a sketch I drew. You drew me? Penelope asked, touched beyond words. Ethan looked embarrassed. I'm no artist, but I wanted you to have something special. It's the most wonderful gift I've ever received, she told him honestly, clutching the locket to her heart. Will you help me put it on? As Ethan fastened the delicate chain around her neck, his fingers brushing her skin, Penelope felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the December cold. When he finished, she turned to face him. I have something for you too, she said, though it's not as beautiful as your gift. From her desk drawer, she withdrew a package wrapped in calico. Inside was a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue wool and a small book of poetry she had ordered from back east. The scarf to keep you warm on your travels, she explained, and the book to remind you there's beauty even in the wilderness. Ethan ran his fingers over the scarf, then the book's leather binding, his expression one of wonder. No one's given me gifts like these before, he admitted quietly. Thank you, Penelope. The Christmas Eve service at the church was a joyous affair. The small building was packed to capacity, lit by dozens of candles that cast a warm glow over the congregation. Penelope's students performed admirably, reciting Bible verses and singing carols with more enthusiasm than precision. Afterward, the entire town gathered for a feast in the hotel's dining room, tables groaning with food contributed by every family. Penelope, seated beside Ethan, felt a sense of belonging she had feared lost forever after her parents' deaths. These people, the stern-faced blacksmith whose daughter was her best student, the jovial barber who told terrible jokes, Mrs. Patterson, with her motherly ways, they had become her community, her family, and Ethan. Ethan had become something else entirely, something she was almost afraid to name, lest speaking it aloud might cause it to vanish like morning mist. As if sensing her thoughts, Ethan leaned closer. "Walk with me," he asked softly. Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars brilliant in the black sky. They walked in comfortable silence through the snow-covered town, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Penelope's hand found Ethan's, and he squeezed it gently. They stopped at the edge of town, looking out over the vast, snow-covered prairie stretching to the horizon. The land that had nearly claimed Penelope's life now seemed beautiful rather than threatening. "I went to look at that land I mentioned," Ethan said suddenly, "the plot south of here." "And," Penelope prompted, her heart beating faster, "it's good land. Better than I remembered. There's a creek running through it, stands of timber for building." He turned to face her. "I've filed a claim under the Homestead Act." "You're staying," Penelope said, unable to keep the joy from her voice. "I'm staying," Ethan confirmed. "Going to build a cabin come spring, plant some crops." He paused, gathering his courage. "But a homestead needs more than just land and a cabin, Penelope. What else does it need?" She asked, though she knew the answer. "It needs a family," Ethan said simply. "It needs a wife." He reached into his pocket and withdrew something small. In the starlight, Penelope could see it was a ring, a simple gold band. "I'm not a man of fancy words," Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I love you, Penelope Winters. Have since I found you standing by that wagon, refusing to give up. You're the bravest, kindest woman I've ever known. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears sprang to Penelope's eyes, freezing on her cheeks in the cold air. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Ethan Quincy, I will marry you." Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms. Their first kiss was tender, a promise of all that was to come, warming them despite the winter night. They were married on New Year's Day, 1868, in the same church where Penelope taught her students. Reverend Clark performed the ceremony, beaming with almost paternal pride. Mrs. Patterson wept openly, claiming she'd known all along they were meant for each other. The entire town turned out for the celebration, offering gifts, advice, and hearty congratulations. That night, in a room at the hotel that the townspeople had decorated with evergreen boughs and ribbon, Penelope and Ethan began their life together, their love a beacon of warmth against the winter cold. As the snows of January and February kept them town-bound, they planned their future. Ethan continued his occasional scouting work, saving every dollar to buy materials for their homestead. Penelope taught her growing number of students, now including the children of the families who had stayed behind from Blackwater's wagon train. In the evenings, they pored over catalogs, selecting seeds for their first crops, discussing what livestock they would need. "Do you ever regret not continuing to California?" Ethan asked one night as they sat planning by the fire. "Never," Penelope replied truthfully. "This is where I was meant to be, with you." When spring finally arrived, melting the snow and turning the prairie green once more, Ethan began work on their cabin. The men of Fort Laramie pitched in, many having benefited from Penelope's teaching of their children. The women prepared meals for the workers and helped Penelope assemble the household items they would need. By early May, the cabin was ready, a sturdy two-room structure with a stone fireplace, real glass windows ordered from back east, and a porch where Penelope imagined they would sit on summer evenings, watching the sun set over their land. The day they moved in, the entire town escorted them to their new home in a festive procession. There was music and dancing, a feast laid out on tables under the trees, and many toasts to their health and happiness. As the last guests departed, leaving the newlyweds alone in their new home, Penelope stood on the porch, watching the wagon of well-wishers disappear down the trail toward town. Ethan came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Happy?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied, leaning back against his solid strength. That night, as they lay together in their new bed, Penelope thought about all the twists of fate that had brought her to this moment. Being left behind by the wagon train had seemed like the end of her world. Instead, it had been just the beginning. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked, stroking her hair. "About how sometimes what seems like the worst thing that could happen turns out to be the best," she answered. "If Blackwater hadn't left me behind, you wouldn't have come back for me. We might never have met." "I like to think we would have," Ethan mused. "Maybe in California or somewhere else down the road. Some people are just meant to find each other." Penelope smiled in the darkness, comforted by the thought. "I believe you're right." Their first year on the homestead was both challenging and rewarding. They planted wheat and corn, raised chickens and a milk cow, and began building the life they had dreamed of. Penelope continued to teach, riding into town 3 days a week, leaving Ethan to work the land. On the days she taught, she would return to find the cabin swept, dinner cooking, and her husband waiting with a smile that still made her heart skip a beat. In the fall, when the harvest was in and the first frost had touched the land, Penelope shared news that brought tears to Ethan's eyes. She was expecting their first child. "A baby," he whispered, placing his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Our child." "Due in spring," Penelope confirmed, covering his hand with hers. "Just when everything is new again." The winter passed in a blur of preparation. Ethan added a third room to the cabin, a nursery with a window facing east so the morning sun would warm it. Penelope sewed tiny garments from soft flannel, while the women of Fort Laramie contributed blankets, a cradle, and endless advice about childbirth and motherhood. In April, as the prairie bloomed with wildflowers, Elena Patricia Quincy entered the world, her lusty cries announcing her arrival. She had her father's blue eyes and a dusting of dark hair like her mother's. Ethan, who had nervously paced outside during the delivery, took his daughter in his arms with trembling hands, his face a mixture of awe and terror. "She's so small," he whispered, afraid to hold her too tightly. "But strong," Penelope assured him, exhausted but radiant. Like her father, news of Eleanor's birth spread quickly through the settlement. Visitors came daily bearing gifts and congratulations. Mrs. Patterson, who had assisted with the delivery, appointed herself honorary grandmother and could often be found rocking the baby while Penelope rested. As spring turned to summer, life settled into a new routine. Penelope took a break from teaching to care for Eleanor, though she continued to tutor advanced students who rode out to the homestead for lessons. Ethan worked from sunrise to sunset, pausing only to spend time with his growing family. On warm evenings, just as Penelope had imagined, they would sit on the porch, Eleanor sleeping in her mother's arms, watching the sun set over their land. In these quiet moments, Penelope would sometimes think of the wagon train that had continued to California without her, wondering what had become of those people, hoping they had found their own happiness. "Any regrets?" Ethan asked one such evening, seeming to read her thoughts as he often did. Penelope looked at him, this man who had ridden back for her when no one else would, who had built them a home with his own hands. who looked at their daughter as if she were the greatest miracle on earth and felt her heart overflow with love. "Not a single one," she replied, leaning over to kiss him softly. "Every step of the journey, every hardship, every tear, they all led me to you, and there's nowhere else I'd rather be than right here with you and Alina on this land we're making our own." Ethan smiled, taking her free hand in his. "When I found you standing alone by that wagon, I had no idea I was finding my whole world. And I had no idea that being left behind would lead me to everything I never knew I wanted," Penelope replied. "Sometimes life's detours take us exactly where we're meant to be." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, they sat in contented silence. A family forged by chance, choice, and love, a love born in adversity and grown strong on the Wyoming frontier. A love that had begun when a cowboy rode back for a woman left behind. The years passed with the rhythm of the seasons, each bringing new challenges and joys to the Quincy homestead. Alina grew from a chubby-cheeked baby to a spirited toddler with her father's adventurous nature and her mother's quick mind. She trailed after Ethan as he worked the fields, solemnly helping to feed the chickens or plant seeds in the vegetable garden Penelope had established near the house. When Alina was 3, Penelope gave birth to their second child, a son they named James after Ethan's father. Where Alina was bold and outgoing, James was thoughtful and observant, content to sit on Penelope's lap while she read to him, his blue eyes wide as he absorbed every word. By 1875, Fort Laramie had grown from a settlement to a proper town. A railroad spur had been completed the previous year, connecting them to the transcontinental line and bringing a surge of new settlers. The one-room schoolhouse where Penelope had first taught had been replaced by a 2-story brick building where she now served as headmistress, overseeing 3 other teachers. Ethan had expanded their homestead to include 160 acres. Their original cabin, though expanded and improved, now served as a storage building. In its place stood a comfortable 2-story house with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides, large windows to catch the light, and enough bedrooms for their growing family and occasional visitors. They had prospered through hard work and determination. Their wheat fields yielded well, and Ethan had developed a reputation for breeding excellent horses, a skill he'd learned during his cavalry days. Their barn housed a dozen fine animals, including Thunder's descendants, who had inherited his strength and intelligence. On a warm June evening in 1876, as they celebrated their 8th wedding anniversary with a family picnic by the creek that ran through their property, Penelope reflected on how far they had come. Alina, now 7, was teaching 5-year-old James to skip stones across the water while 3-year-old Sarah, their youngest, napped on a blanket in the shade. "What are you smiling about?" Ethan asked, settling beside her on the creek bank. "Just thinking about that first day you rode back for me," Penelope replied, leaning against his shoulder. "Did you ever imagine we'd end up here with all this?" Ethan put his arm around her, drawing her close. "Can't say I thought that far ahead. I just knew I couldn't leave you there alone." "My hero," Penelope teased gently, though they both knew there was truth in the words. "Hardly," Ethan demurred. "Just a man who recognized a good woman when he saw one, even covered in trail dust and pointing a rifle at you," Penelope laughed. "Especially then," Ethan grinned. "Showed you had spirit." They watched their children play, contentment settling around them like a comfortable blanket. Life wasn't perfect. There had been hard times, crop failures, illnesses, arguments, but they had weathered each storm together, emerging stronger for the experience. "Mother." "Father, look what I found," Alina called, running toward them with something clutched in her hands. She opened them to reveal a tiny frog, its emerald skin glistening in the sunlight. "He was under a rock," she explained breathlessly. "Can I keep him?" "I'll make him a home in a jar with grass and water." "Living things belong in their natural home, Ellie," Penelope said gently. "You can watch him here by the creek, but then you need to let him go." Alina's face fell momentarily before she nodded in understanding. "I'll show James and then put him back exactly where I found him," she promised, rushing off to find her brother. She has your compassion, Ethan observed, watching their daughter carefully carrying the frog. And your curiosity, Penelope added, a dangerous combination at times, Ethan laughed. That it is, but she'll be fine, they all will, they're growing up strong and true. As the sun began to set, they gathered their picnic things and children, heading back to the house. Eleanor and James ran ahead, playing a game of their own invention while Ethan carried a sleepy Sarah. Penelope walked beside him, carrying the picnic basket, her heart full. The house awaited them, windows glowing with the last light of day. From the distance, it looked exactly like the home Penelope had imagined all those years ago when they were planning their future, a place of safety, of love, of belonging. That night, after the children were tucked in bed, Penelope and Ethan sat on the porch swing, a tradition they had maintained through the years. The prairie stretched before them, bathed in moonlight, peaceful and vast. I got a letter from Mrs. Patterson today, Penelope said, breaking the comfortable silence. She's finally retiring from the boarding house, wants to come visit us next month. It'll be good to see her, Ethan replied, his arm around Penelope's shoulders. The children adore their Grandma Patterson. She changed my life, Penelope mused, if she hadn't taken me in that first day. She changed both our lives, Ethan corrected, gave us a foundation to build from. They fell silent again, listening to the night sounds, crickets chirping, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft rustle of wind through the cottonwood trees they had planted when Eleanor was born. You ever wonder about the others? Penelope asked. From the wagon train. Ethan considered the question. Sometimes, wonder if they made it to California, if they found what they were looking for. I heard from Martha Jenkins last Christmas, Penelope said. You remember, she was one of those who stayed in Fort Laramie when Blackwater moved on. Her sister continued to California with the train. Apparently they did make it, but life there wasn't what they expected. Her sister's husband died in a mining accident, and she ended up running a boarding house in Sacramento. Life rarely turns out the way we expect, Ethan observed. For better or worse, in our case for better, Penelope said firmly. Far better than I could have imagined. Ethan turned to her, taking her hand in his. Even after 8 years of marriage, the touch of his hand on her still sent a flutter through her heart. Have I told you lately how much I love you, Penelope Quincy? He asked, his voice soft in the darkness. You have, she smiled, but I never tire of hearing it. I love you, he said simply, more with each passing day, and I love you, she replied, my cowboy who rode back. He kissed her then, tender and sweet, a kiss that held the memory of all they had been through together and the promise of all that was yet to come. Later, as they prepared for bed, Penelope paused at the window, looking out at the moonlit landscape. From somewhere in the distance came the haunting cry of a wolf, a reminder of the wilderness that still existed beyond their settled land. What is it? Ethan asked, coming to stand behind her. Just thinking about fate, Penelope replied, leaning back against him. How the worst day of my life led to all of this. Providence, Ethan suggested, or maybe just good fortune that put us in the same place at the same time. Whatever it was, Penelope said, turning in his arms to face him, I'm grateful every day. They held each other close, two people who had found in each other not just love, but a home that stretched beyond the walls of their house to encompass the land they had tamed together, the community they had helped build, the family they had created. And as they drifted off to sleep, Penelope's last thought was of that desperate morning when she had awakened to find herself abandoned, never imagining that before the day was over, a lone rider would appear on the horizon, changing the course of her life forever. The following years brought continued prosperity and growth to the Quincy family and to Fort Laramie itself. By 1880, the town had grown to a population of nearly 500, with a proper main street boasting brick buildings, boardwalks, and even a small opera house where traveling companies occasionally performed. The Quincy homestead had become one of the most successful in the county. Ethan's reputation as a horse breeder had spread throughout the territory, bringing buyers from as far away as Denver and Cheyenne. Penelope continued as headmistress of the school, now housed in a fine brick building with large windows and modern desks ordered from Chicago. Their children thrived. Eleanor, at 11, was the image of her mother with the same dark hair and determined spirit, though her eyes were Ethan's clear blue. She excelled in school and had inherited her father's way with horses, spending every spare moment in the stables. 8-year-old James was quieter, a thoughtful boy who loved books and showed a remarkable talent for drawing. His sketches of the homestead's animals and the surrounding landscape revealed an observant eye and skilled hand that impressed everyone who saw them. Little Sarah, now 6, was a sunny child with golden curls and a melodious laugh that could brighten even the darkest day. She followed her older siblings everywhere, determined not to be left out of any adventure. On a crisp September morning in 1880, as Penelope was preparing breakfast, a knock came at the door, an unusual occurrence so early in the day. Opening it, she found a young man in a railroad uniform holding an envelope. "Telegram for Mrs. Quincy," he announced, handing it to her. Telegrams were rare and usually brought news of significant births, deaths, or emergencies. With a flutter of apprehension, Penelope opened it. "Arriving Fort Laramie, stop September 15, stop Hope. To see you and family stop," signed Caroline and Thomas Winters. Penelope stared at the words, her hands trembling slightly. Caroline Winters was her mother's younger sister and Aunt Penelope hadn't seen since childhood. The Winterses had disapproved of Penelope's father, considering him beneath their social station, and had cut ties with the family when he decided to move west. "Who's it from?" Ethan asked, coming into the kitchen with an armful of firewood. "My aunt and uncle," Penelope replied, still stunned. "They're coming to Fort Laramie next week." Ethan set down the wood and came to her side, reading the telegram over her shoulder. "The Boston relatives, the ones who didn't speak to your parents for years," Penelope nodded. "I can't imagine what would bring them all the way out here." "Only one way to find out," Ethan said pragmatically. "We'll meet them when they arrive." The news of impending visitors created a flurry of activity in the Quincy household. Penelope found herself cleaning already clean rooms, baking extra bread, and fretting about the impression their frontier home would make on her sophisticated Eastern relatives. "They'll love it because it's yours," Ethan assured her, watching her rearrange the parlor furniture for the 3rd time. "And if they don't, well, that's their loss." Penelope smiled gratefully at her husband's steadfast support. "You're right, of course, it's been so long and we parted on such terms." On September 15th, the Quincy's rode into town to meet the train from Cheyenne. The children were excited by the prospect of meeting relatives from Boston, a place that seemed as exotic and distant to them as the moon. "Will they talk funny?" Sarah asked as they waited on the platform. James said Boston people talk with strange accents. "They might sound a little different," Penelope admitted, smoothing her daughter's curls. "But it would be impolite to mention it." The train arrived in a cloud of steam and noise, the passengers disembarking with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Penelope scanned the crowd anxiously, finally spotting a distinguished-looking couple descending from one of the first-class carriages. Caroline Winters had aged well, her blonde hair now streaked with silver but still elegantly styled. She wore a traveling outfit of fine gray wool that spoke of wealth and taste. Beside her, Thomas Winters looked every inch the Boston banker he was, from his perfectly trimmed beard to his polished boots. "Aunt Caroline," Penelope called, stepping forward. The older woman turned, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of her niece. For a moment, she seemed unable to speak. "Penelope," she finally said, her voice catching, "you look so much like your mother." There was an awkward pause before Caroline stepped forward and embraced Penelope stiffly. Thomas offered his hand to Ethan, introducing himself with formal courtesy. "These are our children," Penelope said, drawing the 3 forward, "Eleanor, James, and Sarah." Caroline's expression softened as she looked at the children. "They're beautiful," she said, genuine warmth in her voice for the first time. "Truly beautiful." The initial awkwardness gradually eased as they drove back to the homestead. the children's natural curiosity drawing their great-aunt and uncle into conversation. By the time they reached the house, Caroline was promising to show Alina how to embroider handkerchiefs, and Thomas was discussing drawing techniques with James. Over dinner, prepared meticulously by Penelope, the reason for their visit finally emerged. "We've come to make amends," Caroline said directly, setting down her fork. "What happened between our families, it was wrong. Thomas and I have regretted it for years, but pride kept us from reaching out." "What changed?" Penelope asked, trying to keep the hurt of decades from her voice. "We learned of your parents' deaths," Thomas explained. "Far too late, I'm afraid. It was only this summer that we received word through a mutual acquaintance who had heard the news from a traveler. And we realized we couldn't let another day pass without finding you," Caroline continued, reaching across the table to take Penelope's hand. "You're all that's left of our family. We had to know if you were all right." "I am more than all right," Penelope said, glancing at Ethan and their children. "I have a wonderful life here." "We can see that," Thomas acknowledged, looking around the comfortable dining room. "You've built something remarkable here, both of you." Later, as the men enjoyed cigars on the porch and the children showed Caroline their favorite books, Penelope found herself thinking about the strange twists of fate that had brought her to this moment. If her wagon train hadn't left her behind, if Ethan hadn't ridden back for her, she might have continued to California, never establishing the roots that now drew her long-estranged relatives to Wyoming Territory. The Winterses stayed for 2 weeks, gradually relaxing into the rhythm of life on the homestead. Caroline, initially apprehensive about frontier living, soon found herself enjoying the simpler pleasures, gathering eggs from the henhouse with Sarah, picking apples from the small orchard Ethan had planted years earlier, sitting on the porch in the evening listening to the coyotes call in the distance. Thomas, to everyone's surprise, developed an interest in Ethan's horse breeding operation. A former cavalry officer in his youth, he possessed a knowledge of horseflesh that earned Ethan's respect. On their final evening, as they sat in the parlor after dinner, Thomas cleared his throat. "Penelope, we have a proposal for you and Ethan." "A proposal?" Penelope echoed, exchanging a glance with her husband. "We would like to establish a trust fund for your children's education," Thomas explained. "Enough to send each of them to college in the East should they choose to go." Penelope was stunned. "That's incredibly generous, but it's not generosity," Caroline interrupted. "It's family responsibility. Your mother would have wanted her grandchildren to have every opportunity." Ethan, who had been silent, spoke up. "We appreciate the offer, but we're capable of providing for our children's futures." "Of course you are," Thomas agreed quickly. "This isn't charity. Consider it their inheritance from their grandparents' family." Penelope could see the pride warring with practicality in Ethan's expression. "We'll discuss it," she promised her aunt and uncle. "It's a decision we should make together." Later that night, alone in their bedroom, Ethan expressed his reservations. "I don't want them thinking we need their money." "It's not about need," Penelope said gently. "It's about opportunity for the children. Alina already talks about studying medicine. Do you know what it would cost to send her to medical school?" Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair, now touched with gray at the temples. "I just don't want to be beholden to them." "We wouldn't be," Penelope assured him. "This is their way of making amends, of connecting with family they thought lost, and it's their way of honoring my parents' memory." Eventually, Ethan agreed. The next morning, they accepted the Winters' offer with the condition that the children would decide for themselves whether to use the funds when the time came. The day of departure brought unexpected tears from Caroline as she embraced each of her great-nieces and nephew. "We'll come back," she promised. "Perhaps next summer, and when you're older," she told Alina, "you must come visit us in Boston." As the Quincy's watched the train pull away, Ethan put his arm around Penelope's shoulders. "Looks like our family just got bigger," he observed. "It seems so," Penelope agreed. "Life continues to surprise us, in good ways mostly," Ethan smiled. "Mostly because of you," Penelope replied, leaning into his embrace. "Everything good in my life began when you rode back for me." "Best decision I ever made," Ethan said, kissing the top of her head, "and one I'd make again without hesitation." They stood together, watching until the train was just a speck in the distance, then turned toward the home they had built together from nothing but hope and determination, on land that had once seemed alien but now felt as much a part of them as their own heartbeats. As the years continued to pass, the Quincy family witnessed the transformation of Wyoming Territory into the 44th state of the Union in 1890. The railroad brought more settlers, more commerce, and more changes to the region they called home. Fort Laramie continued to grow, eventually renaming itself simply Laramie as the military presence diminished and the civilian population expanded. The Quincy homestead prospered, becoming one of the territories, and then the state's most respected horse breeding operations. Ethan, now in his 50s with silver threading through his once brown hair, had developed a reputation as one of the finest judges of horseflesh in the region. His opinion was sought by buyers from across the country, and several of his horses had won prestigious races in the East. Penelope had retired from her position as head mistress when the youngest of their children, Sarah, left for college. Now she devoted her time to writing educational materials for frontier schools and occasionally lecturing at the newly established Wyoming State Teachers College. Her series of readers, designed specifically for the children of settlers, had been adopted by schools throughout the western states. Their children had grown into remarkable adults. Eleanor, true to her early ambition, had become one of the first female physicians to graduate from the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, thanks in part to the trust established by the Winterses. She had returned to Wyoming and set up practice in Cheyenne, where she specialized in women's and children's health. James had discovered a talent for architecture during his studies at Cornell University. After apprenticing with a firm in Chicago, he had returned to Wyoming to design public buildings for the growing state. His crowning achievement was the new state capitol in Cheyenne, a beautiful structure that combined classical elements with practical features suited to the western climate. Sarah, the family's free spirit, had studied literature and music at Vassar College, much to her great-aunt Caroline's delight. Upon graduation, she had surprised everyone by joining a scientific expedition documenting the flora and fauna of Yellowstone National Park. Her illustrated journal of the expedition had been published to critical acclaim, establishing her reputation as both a naturalist and a writer. On a golden autumn day in 1897, as Penelope and Ethan celebrated their 29th wedding anniversary, their homestead came alive with the sounds of family returning. All three children arrived with their respective spouses and children, Eleanor with her doctor husband and their twin sons, James with his wife and 3 daughters, Sarah with her professor husband and their young son and daughter. The house overflowed with laughter, conversation, and the patter of small feet. Ethan, now a devoted grandfather, spent hours teaching the older grandchildren to ride, while Penelope read stories to the younger ones in the shade of the cottonwood trees that had grown tall and strong over the decades. That evening, as they gathered for a celebratory dinner in the dining room that had been expanded years earlier to accommodate their growing family, Ethan rose to offer a toast. "To Penelope," he said, raising his glass, his blue eyes still bright with the same love that had drawn him back to her all those years ago. "My wife, my heart, my home. 29 years ago, I found you standing alone beside a wagon, and in finding you, I found everything I never knew I was looking for. To Mother," Eleanor added, raising her glass, and Father, James joined in, "who taught us that courage isn't about not being afraid, but about doing what's right despite your fear. To both of you," Sarah concluded, "who showed us what love looks like when it's lived every day." Penelope, tears glistening in her eyes, looked around the table at the family they had created, strong, independent individuals bound together by love and shared history. "To all of us," she said, "and to the strange workings of fate that bring us where we need to be, even when it seems like we've been abandoned along the way." Later, as had become their custom over the years, Penelope and Ethan sat alone on the porch after everyone else had gone to bed. The night was clear, the stars brilliant overhead, the air carrying the scent of autumn leaves and wood smoke. 30 years, Ethan mused, holding her hand in his. Hard to believe it's been that long since I found you, since we found each other, Penelope corrected gently. I was lost until you came back for me. We saved each other, Ethan acknowledged. I was just wandering before I met you, no roots, no purpose beyond the next horizon. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds that had become the backdrop to their lives together, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the trees, the occasional hoot of an owl. You remember what you asked me that first night, Penelope said suddenly. When we camped beside your wagon, Ethan thought for a moment. I asked why you'd trust a stranger, I think. And I said I didn't have much choice, Penelope recalled with a smile. But the truth is, even then, there was something about you that felt right, as if I'd known you all my life. I felt it too, Ethan admitted. Couldn't explain it then, can't really explain it now, just knew I couldn't ride away and leave you there. Penelope squeezed his hand. That's who you are, Ethan, the man who comes back, the man who stays. As they sat together, the warmth of their joined hands a bulwark against the autumn chill, Penelope reflected on the long journey that had brought them to this moment. From that desperate day on the prairie when she thought her life was over, to this peaceful evening surrounded by the family they had built together, it was a road neither of them could have imagined when they first met. The wagon train that had abandoned her had long since reached California, its members scattered to their various fates. Augustus Blackwater, she had heard, had died during an Indian attack in the Sierra Nevadas, never reaching his destination. Others from the train had found success or failure, joy or sorrow, as was the way of life. But here, on this land that had once seemed so hostile and foreign, Penelope had found everything she had ever wanted: a purpose, a home, a family, and a love that had only deepened with the passing years. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "About beginnings and endings," Penelope replied, "and how sometimes they're the same thing." Ethan nodded, understanding as he always did. "The end of your journey west was the beginning of our journey together." "Exactly," Penelope said softly. "And I wouldn't change a single step of it, not even the painful ones, because they all led me here, to you, to our children, to this life we've built." Ethan leaned over and kissed her, a gentle kiss that held the memory of all they had shared and the promise of all that was still to come. "Here's to the next 30 years, he whispered against her lips. "And all the adventures they'll bring," Penelope added, her heart full to overflowing with gratitude for the twist of fate that had left her behind, and for the cowboy who had ridden back for her alone.